Welcome to week 2 of Psychosocial Aspects for Sport. I really like this class because it's just interesting stuff that we see every day in our society, and so ways that we can apply sport to them. And I like watching the news when I'm teaching this class because I feel like I see current events all the time that relate to the things that we're talking about. So I have a lot to say in this little intro message, so I'll go ahead and get underway so we can get on with it, and I don't leave you a 30-minute message which you don't want to listen to. So we had a lot of stuff to look at last week. First of all, we brought up the concept of social theories, so just what those are, how they relate to sport. Where I'm coming from with the format of this class, we're going to be looking at some theories to maybe explain different sides of some social phenomena that we see in our world, and how they can relate to sports, and explain the way that sports affects those phenomena. So we also went over some fundamental definitions of terms like sport and play. And I gave you a classic definition of sport in the Ibrahim article from 1976. So you'll notice that date was a long time ago, and that's why I called it classic, because it's a philosophical definition. It's like classic philosophy. And Ibrahim laid out some necessary conditions for sport on page 27 of that article. If you go back and look, he said that sport must contain expression, competition, and arbitration. So you can go back and look to see what those words mean, and they'll ring a bell. So then I asked you to take that definition and compare that, differentiate it with a more specific and a little more utilitarian modern day definition of sport. And that's what are the criteria that are used to define sport for Title IX compliance purposes. So for that, they have to have competitions during a defined season, a governing organization, coaches, scheduled practices, and competition as its primary goal. So, we've got that broad classical definition of sport that lays out some philosophical elements of what sport is and isn't. But then we've got some very specific criteria that define sport for a specific purpose within a modern day law that we have. So, throughout this class, we'll be kind of comparing and contrasting, a modern day example with maybe a classical or philosophical definition. And this is an example of comparing and contrasting a classic definition of sport with a more specific definition of sport within a gender equity context in our society. So we'll be, like I said, doing that throughout this class. Finally, last week we looked at sport and education, and I asked you some questions about the way that athletics fits into our higher education systems, our colleges and universities. And I really liked that Getz and Siegfried article, and I've got it right here. It's this one with the football, kind of laid out in it. And I really liked this article, the one that's called College Sports: The Mystery of the Zero-Sum Game. And it gave a summary. What this article did was gave a summary of findings about how athletics influences various other aspects of college administration. For example, how much money people donate to the university, or how many applications the university gets. So in what ways does sports, or specifically kind of high-profile wins or postseason appearances, how does that influence some of the administrative aspects of the university? And they had some examples of situations or perceptions that don't match reality. For example, they pointed out on the very first page that most people assume that athletics is a money-maker at FBS schools, when in fact there are only 20-something schools out of 120-something schools that where athletic departments are actually cash positive. That is not operating on a deficit. So, and actually the University of Arkansas is and has been one of those for a long time now. So they're kind of lucky in that way. Another perception that this article pointed out about college sports is that increased sales tax revenue doesn't really happen on game day. A lot of people think it does, and they think that's a trade-off of maybe going into debt for your college athletics department. They found the opposite is true, that local businesses actually report less tax revenue on game days. And then, there were some other aspects of college athletics regarding what happens after a postseason appearance, such as how winning affects the size of an applicant pool, how it affects the academic quality and diversity of applicants. And most of those things were discussed on page 55 of that article, and most of those things kind of had some mixed results depending on how you looked at it. So that was just interesting to see how high-profile wins or postseason appearances affected some of those things, like who applies to the university and who donates to the university. So sometimes they found an effect and sometimes they didn't. And that's what your first discussion question was about. So, it turns out that postseason appearances result in a short-term boost in applications. The size of the applicant pool seems to increase, but it doesn't affect the academic quality of participants. And they hypothesize that maybe athletic success doesn't really matter as much to the more academically oriented students. And most of those are found on page 55. And so that's what I was looking for in your first discussion question. Your other discussion question went over the concept of opportunity cost that was presented in both articles, actually, the next article as well. And that concept, the concept of opportunity cost, refers to what you're giving up in order to have big-time athletics. So in the Siegfried and Getz article that I just discussed, they gave a few examples of schools where athletic departments were expanding, spending more money, but the other areas of the university were suffering. Like they had wage freezes at Rutgers, and then that Ohio University video that I showed you in last week's content showed, leaky ceilings, leaky roofs, while the athletic department was trying to expand. So, that's just an example of where. Of the fundamental question of where if college sports aren't financially sustainable, if those schools aren't schools that are cash positive in their athletic departments, like only 20-something are, then why do it? Why have faculty and staff suffering with no wage increases and leaky buildings while you're going into debt, more debt, expanding athletics? So your Siegfried and Getz article brought up the idea of opportunity cost, and then your other article, your Simon article, brought up both sides of that as well in his article titled "Sports on Campus." And so, we've already asked the question of why wouldn't you, but so Simon also answered the question of why would you? So why is it desirable? And he brought up a few points that we can view sports as a service to the wider community, and that's certainly true. It can affect things like city pride and how much a community comes together. And also, Simon mentioned that athletic and academic values are actually pretty similar. So maybe both can work together to fulfill desirable missions of the university. So both of your articles talked about the concept of that opportunity cost of having sports in a university. It's often a financial drain, but what are we giving up, and also what are we gaining? So those are some things that I was looking for in your second discussion question. So this week we're looking at youth sport, and youth sport is a major part of American culture. Most children in this country play sport of some sort as a child, and we assign a lot of importance to youth sport. We reinforce that behavior by celebrating it and emphasizing it as a desired role. In our culture, cool kids play sports. So we have some articles this week that look at some ways in which youth sports have and can become very serious, maybe too serious in some ways. So youth sports are great, and we all know the benefits, but we're going to just maybe examine a few specific questions about how much is too much. And again, we're going to be referring back to the definition of play, that idea of the classic definition of play that we looked at this past week, and where we might draw that line between play and sport, especially if we're talking about in children, children's play. So this week we've got some discussions based on your readings, and I'm also going to look at your trend analysis preferences that you turned in, and I will assign those. I'll assign you a week and a topic based on your preferences, and I'll post those to the assignment and remind you to look at those so you can know which week you're going. So have a great week, week 2. Here we go. Have a good one.